Saber, Rattling in East Asia, the challenge that China and North Korea pose to regional stability and security. To moderate this session, we're pleased to have with us Gordon Chang, who is the author of two books. The first one, The Coming Collapse of China, and the most recent one, Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World. Gordon is a contributor at Forbes.com, and he's also a blogger at the World Affairs Journal. Please join me in welcoming Gordon Chang, who will moderate this discussion.
Well, thank you, Clark, and thank you, everyone, for participating in this East Asia session. In East Asia, there's an assertive China that is roiling its periphery from India in the south to South Korea in the north. At the same time, it is trying to dominate the global commons, and it's using forceful tactics to enlarge its borders. We also have North Korea, which is, again, lashing out. It's building fearsome weapons, and it's selling them to various parties around the world, including the Iranians. Now, unfortunately, the international community has yet to develop effective responses to these two states, and that's what we're going to talk about today with Ambassador Masaichi, Bonnie Glaser of the Center for International Security in Washington, D.C., and Yoon Lee of the Fletcher School. Bonnie, I want to start by asking a fundamental question. And you're the best person to talk about this because you are a leading China watcher. If we go back about 15 years, everyone was talking about Chinese diplomacy as being both deft and effective. And someone that both of us know even called it a thing of beauty. Today, however, no one really talks about China in those terms, because its foreign posture has become aggressive and in some cases even belligerent. And so the question is, what accounts for this change and why did things go so wrong?
Well, I would point out first that China's narrative about itself has even changed. So in the early 2000s, China talked about its peaceful rise. And Xi Jinping, the new leader in China, no longer uses that vocabulary. But let me just tick off a few reasons why I think that we have seen this more aggressive behavior from China. We really trace this back to the onset of the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009. China began to see the beginning of US decline, the potential for the real narrowing of the gap between Chinese and American capabilities. The notion of China's re-rise, the resurgence as a great power, was no longer a slogan. It was something that was actually seen as a real potential. Secondly is opportunities. The Chinese responded to opportunities and create their own opportunities. So as Ambassador Ishii knows well, there was incidents in 2010 with the Chinese fishermen, in 2012 when the Japanese bought 3 of the Senkaku islands from private citizens. The Chinese seized upon those opportunities. And they assessed that the United States under President Obama would not react strongly. And to some extent, I would say they were correct. Thirdly, capabilities. China's capabilities 10 years ago to push back against other nations, and particularly the US and the region, were really quite limited. If we look today at what we call the white hulls and the gray hulls, the Coast Guard ships, the Navy ships, the Chinese have far more capabilities than they had. So they can enforce their claims over water and airspace, fishing, for example. The fourth reason is domestic. Xi Jinping has attached priority to strengthening the rule of the Chinese Communist power, and he needs to forge national unity. So the Navy made the request, essentially, in the early Xi Jinping administration. He came to power really late in 2012. And they asked to build these artificial islands in the South China Sea. And Xi Jinping said, go ahead and do it. So he wanted to secure support from the military, and he needed to have their support and the support of the people. So this is about legitimacy of the party, Xi Jinping's Chinese dream, bringing the Chinese interests to the fore. Xi Jinping talks about never suffering the humilities, the injustices that the foreigners wreaked against China in the past. And so I think this is a core concept as well. And then finally, and this is of course extremely important, is security. The Chinese want to exert greater control over their near seas, Yellow Sea, South China Sea, East China Sea. This is what they claim. They have historically been invaded from the south, and they are determined to prevent other nations from posing threats to Chinese territories. So this strategy of building up anti-access, area denial capabilities, useful in peacetime, probably in a crisis, very vulnerable in wartime.
Let me press you on something, because you mentioned the legitimacy of the party when you discussed Xi Jinping's posture. A number of people think that there is increasing turbulence at the top of the Communist Party and that this is feeding China's more aggressive posture. But of course, not everyone agrees. So where do you come out on this issue?
Well, I think that there has been some pushback against Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign. Although some people say it hasn't gone far enough, there are others who don't want to be the next target. They're not just in the military, they're also at senior places in the party. We hear complaints from intellectuals, but the reports about a petition that allegedly was written calling for Xi Jinping to step down from power, here I'm somewhat skeptical. I believe that this was actually conceived of and written outside of China. At CSIS, we've done some forensics on this. And this looks like something that was written by dissidents outside of China and then through hacking posted on a domestic website.
Interesting, because many people do look at what's happened last month and have done the forensics, and it is fascinating, all of the possible commutations. Mr. Ambassador, let me come to you. You're not only Tokyo's ambassador to Brussels, but more important for this discussion, you're Tokyo's representative to NATO. And in the first session of yesterday, we heard about how NATO's response to Russian aggression in Crimea and eastern Ukraine has been both muted and low-key, largely because people are concerned about trying to manage Russia's decline. And so therefore, there's more of a willingness to sort of work with Russia because they don't want to trigger something untoward. When we look at China, and certainly your country has been a target of China's belligerence in the last 3 or 4 years, when we look at China, it's certainly not a country in decline. Most people think it's ascendant. Some people say it's the owner of the 21st century. And yet our response to China's provocative moves is often muted and low-key. And so the question is, are we adopting the right response when you look at NATO, when you look at the United States and the countries in the region as they try to react to China?
Thank you, Gordon. First thing first, happy birthday, Don. I think you are 1 day and many decades younger than the Queen.
I just want to say for the record that I would have wished her happy birthday, but she told me not.
I asked you not to.
I'm sorry.
Which is the reason why she got the first question, because this is her birthday.
Okay, I'm sorry about. Okay, straight to your question. Are we up to the challenge? My shortest response is we are almost there, while still learning some lessons, and we don't mind having a little bit of help coming from NATO or European aspirants. That's the shortest answer to your question. I think good news is rising China is not new for us. We've been living as a neighbor of China for the past 2,000 years, and most of the time China is much bigger, more prosperous, much stronger than Japan. So I think our objective is quite clear, to live happily and prosperously together, coexistence with China. That is the only way. So it is quite clear. It's been so, it will continue to be so. So how can we do it is the question. First, of course, obviously, as we have done in the past, we translate existing lot of common interests into the actual projects, right? Economy, environment, and even energy. I think we are two big consumers. We share the same sea line of communication. So in theory, nobody has appetite for having any tension through the South China Sea and the East China Sea. So there must be something wrong about what China is doing. And we have a chance to rectify it, I think. Well, alliance we have with the United States is up to the challenge. We've been strengthening the network of alliance. Rather than having two bilateral alliances, we are creating networks and striking out security ties with and among the allies of the United States. So we are much stronger. But I do believe we can use a little bit of help, as I said, coming from NATO, if they so wish, and involvement of some aspirants in Europe, such as UK and France. And third, we have a minimum level of crisis management mechanism. We can pick up the phone to talk to them. So we are okay. But for me, the biggest challenge where we are still learning lessons is rule making. This is an era where we have unprecedented rising powers. Not only China, but also India is rising, which means 1/3 of the world population belong to the countries which are rising. Inevitably, we have to be able to adjust the existing rules or creating new rules where necessary in order to take into consideration the perspectives of these rising powers. That's what we have to do. But the most important thing in doing so is we need to distinguish where we can change and where we should stick to the existing ones. The existing rules which should not be changed are things like, you're not supposed to change status quo unilaterally by force. So I think that this connects Ukraine and South China Sea. And things like pacta sunt servanda. What you agree will abide you. So I think these are the things we need to stick to, but there are many things we can adjust. And I think AIIB was a typical example. I think having a new investment bank is a good thing. Competition by idea is a good thing. The only problem we had is that we, means West or status quo power, should have sat down and talk about what we can change and what we cannot. So I think my short conclusion is Europe will be very, very relevant in doing these rule-making efforts.
Well, rulemaking, of course, is important, but when it comes to China and Japan, one of the critical issues has, of course, a lot to do with rules, but there China is intent on breaking them in the sense of you have islands, the Senkakus in the East China Sea. China believes that they are Chinese, even though the first time they raised their claim to them was 1971. And before that, they did acknowledge that those islands were Japanese. But now the Chinese have a very different position on it. And that's okay. I mean, countries change their ideas about sovereignty all the time. But China is using very difficult tactics against your country. And it would seem to me that that would be at the #1 top of the list of China's relations, your relations with China at the moment.
Well, among other things. But I think the past history shows us that whenever you create vacuum, it's like inviting the infiltration from the other side. So that's what we try not to do. So I think we cannot make decisions for China. They make decisions for themselves. So what we can do is to create a situation where China sees that what they are doing are making the situation not in favor of them. So maybe what we can do is strengthen our grip on the existing islands, always be ready to face with the Chinese official ships coming to within the 12 nautical mile every 10 days. That's what we are doing. So I think the cooperation and the strengthening of the alliance with the United States is inevitable and also critical.
It's absolutely critical. Let's talk about another rule breaker here. And you're from the Fletcher School, which by definition means you've got all the answers. So it's good that you're here.
Of course, naturally.
With North Korea, it's on a dangerous path at the moment, of course. It has a young leader, Kim Jong-un, who was executed by the count of the South Korean intelligence service, some 100 or so people since he took over in December 2011. You also have his execution of his uncle, and by my count, 3 4-star generals in the last 15 months. And of course, as we all know, North Korea is developing weapons and has indeed got a weapons program on steroids, and this is starting to look extremely dangerous. And so the question going forward is going to be, we've been trying to manage North Korea over the last 5 or 6 years, maybe even a bit longer than that. But we haven't succeeded. And so the question is this sort of management approach, something that we've seen with regard to Russia and China, is this working with North Korea, and how do you see it going forward?
Let me try to address that question by making a bizarre statement at the risk of self-deterrence, that is never being invited back to the Aspen Security Forum. I believe Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, is outside the Korean Peninsula the most famous Korean individual in the world. More widely recognized than any other South Korean or North Korean individual. No disrespect to my fellow South Korean, the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, but perhaps Kim Jong-un is more widely recognized in other parts of the world, perhaps including the United States, than the Chinese leader. And this speaks to the bizarre dynamic in the Korean Peninsula, where you have a two-state formulation and ongoing contest for pan-Korean legitimacy between a model success case, South Korea, a global leader in electronics, shipping, and so forth, and a model failed state, the DPRK. But more importantly, I think the image of this bizarre, somewhat unstable young leader presiding over an impoverished nation of 24 million people often renders North Korea misunderstood, reduces it to an abstraction or a caricature. We tend to laugh at North Korea, and that tendency goes back all the way to the Korean War. For example, during the war, Mr. Barrett, Edward Barrett, in the State Department, Assistant Secretary, said that the relationship between Stalin and Kim Il-sung, the founder, is exactly the same as that between Walt Disney and Donald Duck. In the aftermath of North Korea's second nuclear test, which came on May 25th, 2009, Memorial Day in the United States, they have a tendency to do these things on a major holiday, both theirs as well as America's, and Sundays to create more political pressure. When you do something like that on a Sunday or a holiday, as of the next morning, there's an intense global competition. You are the global headline for a few days, and that means as journalists are knocking on the White House, the State Department, demanding a response, you have to come up with some kind of a response. And in the past, that response has been, after a decent interval, return to talks with bigger concessions in tow. And that's worked very well in North Korea's interest, I would say. Hillary Clinton, Secretary Clinton, after North Korea's second nuclear test, which was preceded by a long-range missile test on Sunday, April 5th, 2009, just hours before President Obama was to give his first major foreign policy speech in the Czech Republic on a world without nuclear weapons. They have a keen sense of timing. Secretary Clinton said North Korea is like a child throwing a temper tantrum, and the thing to do is not to reward that child with attention. While I understand that sentiment, I would submit to everyone that North Korea is quite crafty. In fact, the story of North Korea's nuclear diplomacy and extortion, how this country that's aid-dependent, that's so totalitarian, managed to outmaneuver the world's biggest countries, including the United States, China, Russia, Japan, South Korea, and wrested away from these countries, by my estimation, at least $20 billion worth of blandishments, including cash, over the past quarter century, will probably become one day one of the more interesting, ignoble episodes in the annals of international history.
You know, that's an important point, because when you think about it, North Korea is a small state. It's been destitute, and people talk about it being on the verge of collapse. And the United States, is, at least at the end of World War II, was the most powerful nation in history. Certainly at the end of the Cold War, a predominant nation. And yet, for the disparity in power, it seems that North Korea always seems to get the better of us. I mean, I just don't understand this in the sense of, shouldn't there be where the big powers are able to get together with the support of the international community, and yet you have this destitute state always seeming to win? I just don't get it.
Well, in defense of restraint, in fact, there has been never any kind of penalty meted out against North Korea's countless provocations, many lethal but always controlled, small-scale provocations, attacks against South Koreans and American personnel, soldiers in South Korea. There has never been any kind of punishment. even in the cases of egregious attacks like on Kim Il-sung's birthday in 1969, North Korean jets tagged and shot down a US spy plane in international airspace, killing all 31 US servicemen. There was a lot of talk of retaliation, airstrikes, blockade, naval blockade, even nuclear weapons, but nothing was done. In defense of that restraint, I would say that since the end of the Korean War in 1953, we have enjoyed de facto peace, unstable, very much imperfect, but real peace, no war in the Korean Peninsula. Whereas if you look at the 60-year period leading up to the outbreak of the war in 1950, you have 4 major wars in and around the Korean Peninsula. And this has been a happy period for the South Koreans especially, a period of unprecedented prosperity. But at the same time, I think we have to admit that we have conditioned North Korea really to do things with impunity, to get away with murder.
You know, Bonnie, it's interesting because, you know, Yoon talks about the failure to impose costs on North Korea. And we can almost say the same thing about China. You know, what it's doing in the South China Sea, East China Sea, has really been destructive of global peace and order. And yet there's been no costs imposed on Beijing for this.
Well, first there's the question of North Korea and whether we are posing costs on North Korea. And you haven't yet talked about the recent UN Security Council 2270, which at least is taking these sanctions in a more serious direction. They are more biting than they have been before. And of course, the main reason why we have not seen really sharp sanctions against North Korea, like we have seen with Iran in the past, is because of China. The Chinese have been loath to approve any kind of economic sanctions. So they have tried to simply support targeted sanctions against the WMD program. This time, we have seen a new kind of resolution. Coal, iron ore in particular, exports from North Korea into China are essentially banned. Going to be very difficult, I think, to implement. Jury's out as to whether or not China will actually honor them. No kerosene exported to North Korea. They use that to fuel their aircraft. So this is an interesting test going forward, and I would argue we have never tested the proposition of whether very serious biting sanctions against North Korea could roll back its nuclear weapons program. Many argue that they wouldn't work, but we, I believe, have not yet tested that proposition. As for China's violations of the rules, that's it. When we look at what's going on in the South China Sea, China's surrounded by smaller, weaker neighbors who benefit from China's economic largesse. They want good relations with China. They want to benefit from China's rise. And they really don't have the capability to push back against China. Many of them are demanding that the United States step up and do more to push back. We see the Philippines now inviting the United States back into essentially access to the bases that we left and more in the early 90s. The jury is still out on whether U.S. pushback, which I think has really just recently begun in the last year, freedom of navigation operations around these artificial islands, whether these actions will change China's calculus and force it to abide by the rules. But imposing costs is very, very difficult. Nobody wants to impose economic sanctions on Asia, certainly not Europe.
Sure.
Or China.
And when we talk about imposing costs, the one thing that Tokyo has done, Mr. Ambassador, is that it has now started to develop much stronger relations with India, with Australia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. We've seen Japanese ships in the South China Sea. This is a very interesting development. It seems to me that, when Bonnie talks about no one wants to impose sanctions, I think that's absolutely right. The question is going to be, how do you deal with a China that does not want to play by the rules that you talked about? But I think that probably Tokyo's response has been to be much more proactive in terms of building these relationships with countries around the region.
As I mentioned, we cannot make decisions for them. It's
Sure.
only them who can make decisions. We can create situations which they take into consideration. From that viewpoint, Gordon, what you mentioned is quite an important thing. You know, now we have a strategic partnership with the Philippines, to which we have gave a yen loan enough to buy 20 brand new Coast Guard ships. We've given Vietnam 2 second-hand Coast Guard ships. We have done the same to Indonesia. And we are now doing military capacity building with these countries, Vietnam, Malaysia, India, Indonesia, Philippines, and so on and so forth. And we have created, as you said, a triangular relation between Japan and the United States and India, where we have biannual, even Navy-to-Navy exercise. So I think if I had seen this picture from Chinese side, I would think that they are more surrounded. I'm more surrounded by those like-minded countries, and linkage, security cooperation among those guys are getting closer and closer. What should we do? I think I wouldn't be surprised if that is a paranoia China may see from their own prism. So we just have to continue to do this. While I think the door is always open to China, as I mentioned, China's a big guy. We need to live happily and prosperously together with them. And you know, when it comes to for example, to secure the freedom of navigation throughout the Indian Ocean, our basic starting point is Japan, US, India trilateral cooperation. And we are happy to include some of the European countries, even NATO ships, or France, UK, while they're passing to their way to the Pacific. But we can even open the door to China to join the joint exercise in Indian Ocean. After all, we share the same sea and communication. So.
And Bonnie, just what the ambassador said seems to me almost like the building of an effective coalition. We may not call it that, but you do see countries in the region working much more closely with each other as they try to work with China on the long-term basis. As you try to develop the rules, you nonetheless are developing these military relationships. What I'd like to do is open up to questions. Let me see. Right here. And while we do that, I think that as we go forward, we are probably going to see a different architecture, a security architecture in Asia, and led by, in many ways, Japan, taking a very important role in all of this. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Mark Jabelli. I'm curious, is what animates sort of the Chinese vision? Is it fundamentally subversive of the liberal international order, or are they simply seeking the accommodation, clout, and security that is due a great power? Because one suggests, you know, closing ranks within the sort of international community, while the other suggests a more containment-like approach to how we deal with China and their breaking of the rules.
What a great question. Bonnie, that has your name written all over it.
Well, Gordon, unfortunately, you're a moderator. I know you would love.
I would love to answer that question, but I'm not going to do it. I'm not taking the bait, so it's yours, Bonnie. I would answer one word, yeah, they are trying to subvert the international order, but I'm not allowed to say that.
China has benefited more than any other country in the world from the post-World War II international order. They recognize it, and in many ways, they are seeking to make it work to their advantage. They are not seeking to upend it. Take the United Nations. China is extremely supportive of the UN, and no country interfering in any other country's internal affairs without having UN backing. That would simply be one example. There are elements of the international system that the Chinese are dissatisfied with and would like to revamp in some way. Certainly they want to have more of a voice in the World Bank and the IMF. They've recently increased their voting shares. The creation of the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank is an example of ways in which they are trying to strengthen China's voice and ways of doing things. So I don't accept the fact that the Chinese are completely trying to change the international order and put themselves at the top of it. I just don't think they're that ambitious.
There's a question over here.
Gordon, a bit in line with my last question, which we just discussed. There are memes floating around about China and its intent and abilities with regard to the nuclear question and to North Korea. And one of those is that China is helping in the Six-Nation conversation to disarm or to slow down nuclear progress in North Korea. And personally, I don't see that. I think that the proof of it not being the case is that China has so much control over North Korea's economy that if it really were upset about the bomb, it would take about 15 minutes to change North Korea's mind. That's my personal opinion. There's so much flow across that border in terms of survival of North Korea, the absolute survival of North Korea, that China literally has a light switch which it can turn on and off. And it chooses not to turn it off. So words aside, clearly this is not a priority for China. And I don't know whether or not this is something that China actually prefers to have happen. It's kind of a straw man. So, you know, this development on its shores could actually be a benefit to China. And so I'm curious if the people here have an opinion about that.
Yoon.
Please. We know that with each nuclear test by North Korea, going back to its first on Columbus Day, October 9th, 2006, China in the ensuing 12-month period increased aid to North Korea. In 2013, Xi Jinping was incensed. It was his first Lunar New Year celebrations in February. That's when North Korea did it again. Made a lot of angry statements, said he's going to punish North Korea, but actually increased aid to North Korea, hitting an all-time high of $6.5 billion in trade. Historically, North Koreans have insulted, defied Mao, Deng, and let me just give you an example very quickly. In 1956, when Kim Il-sung started to purge, kill off pro-Chinese, pro-Soviet party officials, the two patron states did something patronizing. They sent a joint punitive mission into Pyongyang. The Chinese delegate was Peng Do-hwai, the commander in the Korean War, and the Soviet person was Anastas Mikoyan. They flew into Pyongyang together from Beijing and reprimanded Kim Il-sung. You got to stop doing this. Kim Il-sung felt insulted, did it anyway, killing off purging all pro-Soviet, pro-Yan'an, pro-Chinese officials. And what happened? Was he punished? No. The following year, Kim Il-sung had his first face-to-face meeting with Mao since the insult on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the Russian Revolution in Moscow. Mao apologized profusely, and later on, Mao would do that again after the row between the two countries during the Cultural Revolution in the mid to late 60s, when things were really bad, when the Chinese were killing Kim Il-sung, a fat aristocrat, millionaire, and so forth. My point here is, the more North Korea acts in a militant way, compromising Chinese security interests, the more likely China is to increase aid. So I do believe that the vectors of national interest don't run on a parallel course forever. There may come a day when the Chinese would be perfectly happy to wave bye-bye to the DPRK, but that day is not here. And Bonnie spoke of this very tough UN Security Council resolution, yes, but each UN Security Council resolution against North Korea, going back all the way to North Korea's 7-rocket missile salute on America's 235th birthday, that is 4th of July, 2006, each resolution has been tougher, more creative than the previous one. At the same time, UN Security Council resolutions are a bit like an individual's New Year's resolution. At first, there is great will, but the will invariably dissipates after time. There is non-compliance, flagrant violation, then inertia, and the problem grows. So I think the real question is, yes, China is doing things now to punish North Korea a little bit, but how long will that be sustained?
This goes back to our concept of trying to manage problems and not being very effective in this. Mr. Ambassador? Oh, yeah.
I was just going to briefly add, the notion that China wants nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula is something that I don't think is correct. I think the Chinese really would like to see no nuclear weapons, or they don't want Japan to go nuclear, they don't want South Korea or Taiwan to go nuclear. There are no benefits to China, I think, particularly with an unpredictable leader. But what they worry about is not so much that Kim Jong-un is going to use nuclear weapons against China. It's the US reaction to this nuclear program. If there were to be a transfer of nuclear materials, or a threat to use nuclear weapons, the ability to mount a warhead on a long-range missile and deliver it to the United States, this could really animate U.S. policy and force a U.S. president perhaps to even decide to take out a missile on a launch pad. So this kind of chaos in North Korea that could evolve either from internal or external reasons can result in U.S. intervention. This is what the Chinese fear the most. They don't want to have a situation where the U.S. South Korea forcibly unify the peninsula. U.S. forces could be deployed north of the 38th parallel. This is what the Chinese ultimately do not want to see. They could live with nuclear weapons on the Korean peninsula if everybody else accepted them. And so I would agree with that.
A question back here. Afterwards, by the way, sir, I'll talk to you about Chinese complicity in North Korea and Iran, because I do think that there is various troubling developments there which we need to sort of sort through. I think everything that Bonnie says is correct, but nonetheless, there are these undercurrents which are also important. Yeah.
Ruth Smith, a countering WMD consultant to the U.S. government. It is discouraging in these kind of fora where we talk about the problem with the nuclear program in North Korea, and everyone talks about how embarrassing it is, and everyone talks about how we lack will to follow through in response to provocations. When we have talks and we get some specific outcomes, for instance, the disablement of the Yongbyon reactor in 2007, and then they announce the desire to continue refurbishing and using the reactor. When you have something very specific like that, it was a concession that we earned, and then something that they very specifically went back on in a public way, what would be an appropriate measured response from the United States or from the international community?
Yoon?
I fear my Church of England primary school grammar teacher would wince at this, but may I say North Korea is uniquely unique. It's really different. And perhaps the most uniquest aspect is that North Korea is the only country in world history that enjoy the tremendous economic advantages of full industrialization, urbanization, 100% literacy among its adult population, yet suffer the famine. There's never been anything like that, and probably never will be. It was a man-made famine. We have this notion that North Koreans are hungry today because they have no money, the regime has no money. It's simply not true. Even in those days, North Korea spent $7 billion on defense, purchased 40 outdated Soviet MiGs, spending $1.5 billion. If North Korea had spent a fraction of that, maybe 100 million, at most 200 million with which to buy food, no one, not a single man, woman, child needed to die. My point here is we have never exploited fully North Korea's systemic vulnerabilities, which are twofold in my view. The regime's preponderant dependence on international financial transactions. Second, its egregious human rights violations. The reason that the regime tries its best to keep the people in the dark is because, well, if the people know more fully about that other Korean state, the one that is far more prosperous and more pleasant, there could be an existential threat. So in terms of North Korea's dependence on illicit streams of revenue, there is a new US sanctions legislation that finally brings up US sanctions against North Korea almost up to the level of US sanctions against many other countries, including Iran, Syria, Zimbabwe, Belarus, including many countries that pose no security threat to the United States. And the crux of these sanctions are secondary sanctions, so-called, not only penalize the primary target, Pyongyang, but also North Korea's enablers. So it remains to be seen whether that will bring real changes anytime soon, but there's some promise there. Also in terms of human rights violations, in the new sanctions legislation, Section 301, for example, stipulates that the United States President is required to submit to Congress a detailed plan for providing the North Korean people with inexpensive communications tools, including cell phones, USB, and so forth. So those are the two weaknesses, vulnerabilities that we should exploit, rather than go back to conventional diplomacy with a view that if we are a little nicer, more civil, maybe they'll listen to us.
Mr. Ambassador.
Yeah, just a quick comment. From a different perspective, and this is my purely private, personal viewpoint, but in Asia, we have a history that tells us that in a country with that kind of system, the third generation is the most difficult generation to survive. First generation comes with a lot of charisma. Second generation inherits some charisma, then creates few problems. Third generation, charisma runs out, huge problems.
But we have the third generation now.
Yeah. So I think, I'm not saying we are seeing the beginning of the collapse yet, but I cannot exclude that possibility at all while Kim Jong-un is in power. So what we should do this time to be ready for that kind of unthinkable scenario is, now they have nuclear weapons, right? I mean, we need, once we see the collapse happen, somebody have to move in and then secure nuclear weapons, nuclear materials, nuclear physics. I'm sure Korea moves in, I'm sure US moves in, and I'm sure China will move in. So the question for us is, how can we do it without having mishap between the United States and China and Korea? So these are the things we need to start talking about with China. And I don't think we can do it. We means government officials can do that. I think Bonnie can do that.
Okay, so I think what we got is an answer that Bonnie should be the next Secretary of State, which I think is absolutely a great idea. I want to thank the terrific questions from the audience and certainly this fabulous, fabulous panel. So thank you very much.
Happy birthday.
Thank you so much.